So King Charles has just shocked everyone by pushing to give Harry more than the institution agreed to, and William is refusing to back down. And this is the part nobody predicted, because for months, every crisis this family has navigated has had Charles and William on the same side. They disagreed on methods sometimes, they argued about timing, but the direction was always the same: institutional clarity, clean lines, frameworks that held. And now, for the first time, they're not on the same side. Charles wants to open a door for Harry that William insists has to stay closed. And William, who has spent months building the frameworks his father kept agreeing to, is now standing in front of his father and saying no, not to Harry, to the king. Before we go any further, two quick things. First, if you're new here, we're Crown Watch, and we break down the royal stories that actually matter, so hit subscribe. And second, if you want the details the mainstream coverage never touches, head to theroyalfiles.com. There's something on that site we don't talk about here on the channel, a hidden piece of royal history most people never find. The link is in the description. Okay, let's get into it. Here's what happened. Harry's return to Britain activated everything the family had been preparing for. The frameworks, the conditions, the security arrangements, the terms of engagement, all of it, carefully built over months, was now live. And the early stages went exactly as planned. Harry was in Britain. The institutional response was measured, the terms held, the conditions applied, everything was working the way it was supposed to work. And then Charles saw his son. And whatever happened in that private encounter, whatever passed between a father and the child he'd been missing for years, it changed something in Charles. Not his understanding of the institution's needs, his willingness to accept them as the final word. Charles came back from that encounter and started pushing, not publicly, not dramatically, through the internal channels that govern how the palace operates. He began asking whether certain conditions could be loosened, whether certain access restrictions could be adjusted, whether the terms that had been set were truly as rigid as they needed to be. Each request individually was small, an adjustment here, a flexibility there, nothing that looked on its own like a fundamental challenge to the framework. But William saw the pattern immediately, because William has spent the last several months watching patterns. He has learned through painful experience that small adjustments accumulate, that flexibility in one area creates expectations in another, that a framework with exceptions is a framework with holes. And he recognized in his father's requests the beginning of the same kind of incremental erosion that Camilla had used to try to expand her own position. Before we go further, real quick, if you're into deep dives on royal stories that actually sit with the complexity instead of just picking a side, hit subscribe and join us here at Crown Watch. We are building something good. Okay, back to it. Now here's the first twist, and it's the one that makes this different from anything the family has faced before. Because when William pushed back on Charles's requests, Charles didn't defer. He didn't soften. He didn't do the thing he has done in every previous confrontation, which is to accept the institutional logic and quietly absorb the personal cost. This time, Charles pushed back on the pushback. He told William that the frameworks were too rigid, that the conditions were designed for a theoretical return and were proving too harsh for the actual human being who had returned, that seeing Harry in person had shown him something the frameworks couldn't capture, which was that his son was not a policy problem to be managed, but a person who needed his father. And Charles said directly that he intended to adjust the terms to reflect what he had seen. William's response was immediate. He said no, not eventually, not through advisors, not through the careful institutional language that usually governs disagreements between the king and his heir. He said no directly to his father's face. And the room went quiet, because this was something that had never happened before. William had disagreed with Charles on methods. He had pushed for firmer positions. He had built frameworks Charles hadn't fully understood, but he had never directly refused a request from the king, never looked his father in the eye and said the answer is no, and I'm not moving. That refusal is the most significant moment in the relationship between Charles and William since the crisis began, because it changed the dynamic between them fundamentally. Until that moment, William had operated with Charles's implicit authority. He had built frameworks the king had signed. He had made decisions the king had approved. He had moved with the weight of Charles's agreement behind him, and now Charles was withdrawing that agreement, pulling in the opposite direction, asking for the very kind of flexibility that every framework had been designed to prevent. And William was standing where the framework stood, holding the line against his own father. Now here's the second twist, and it explains why William refused to move. Because William understood something Charles apparently didn't. He understood that adjusting the terms for Harry wouldn't just affect Harry, it would affect everything. Every framework the family had built over the last several months was connected. The reformed Charles had signed tying everything to duty, the conditions governing Camilla's future, the security arrangements, the succession planning architecture. All of it was built on the same set of principles. And the moment you adjust the principles for one person, you adjust them for everyone. If Harry's conditions were loosened because Charles felt they were too harsh, then Camilla's conditions could be loosened for the same reason. The security framework could be expanded, the succession architecture could be softened, every decision the family had made would be reopened, because the principle underlying all of them would have been shown to bend when the king wanted it to bend. William saw that chain reaction immediately. Charles, operating from emotion rather than architecture, didn't see it. And that's the fundamental difference between the two men in this moment. Charles was thinking about Harry. William was thinking about the system. Charles wanted to give his son more because seeing his son had made the limits feel cruel. William wanted to hold the limits because relaxing them for one person would destroy the limits for everyone. And both of them were right in their own way, which is what makes the conflict so hard. Now here's where Princess Anne enters. And her role is the one that determines how this resolves, because Anne understood both positions. She understood Charles's fatherly impulse because she's human, and she understood William's institutional logic because she's Anne. And she saw the thing neither of them could see from their own position, which is that they were both arguing about the wrong question. Charles was asking whether the terms could be loosened. William was arguing that they couldn't. And Anne pointed out that the real question wasn't whether the terms could change, but whether the terms had been right in the first place. Because if the terms were right, then Charles' desire to change them was the problem. And if the terms were too harsh, then William's refusal to change them was the problem. And the only way to know which was true was to evaluate the terms against reality rather than defending them against emotion. That intervention is pure Anne. She doesn't take sides. She reframes the question until the answer becomes obvious. And the reframing, in this case, forced both men to do something uncomfortable. It forced Charles to examine whether his desire to loosen the terms was genuinely about the terms being wrong or about the terms being painful for someone he loved. And it forced William to examine whether his refusal to loosen them was genuinely about institutional integrity or about the institutional posture having become more important to him than the reality it was supposed to govern. Catherine's contribution was characteristically precise. She looked at the specific adjustments Charles was requesting and separated them into two categories. The first category was adjustments that would genuinely undermine the principles the frameworks were built on. Access to institutional channels, influence over appointments. Standing that implied a return to working royal status. Those, Catherine said, could not be granted. Period. The principle was the principle. The second category was adjustments that didn't touch the principles at all. Personal access to the family, informal presence at private gatherings, the ability to visit without every interaction being governed by institutional terms. Those, Catherine pointed out, had been restricted not because the principles required it, but because the frameworks had been built broadly, designed to cover every possibility, and had swept personal contact into the same category as institutional engagement. That distinction is the thing that broke the deadlock. Because Catherine showed both men that they were arguing past each other. William was defending principles that weren't actually being threatened by what Charles was asking for, and Charles was asking for flexibility in areas where the frameworks had been unnecessarily rigid. The solution wasn't to loosen the frameworks or to hold them as they were, it was to make them more precise, to draw a sharper line between the institutional conditions which had to hold and the personal arrangements which had been over-restricted by frameworks designed for a different purpose. William heard Catherine and recognized that she was right. The frameworks he'd built had been designed to manage every possible interaction between Harry and the institution. And in their thoroughness, they had also restricted interactions that weren't institutional at all. A father seeing his son, a grandfather meeting his grandchildren, the ordinary human contact that any family maintains. William's frameworks had swept all of it into the same managed category, not because the principles required it, but because the frameworks hadn't been precise enough to distinguish between institutional engagement and personal contact. Catherine had identified the error, and the error, once identified, could be corrected without touching the principles. Charles heard Catherine and recognized something equally important, that his desire to loosen the terms had been partially right, the personal restrictions were unnecessarily harsh, and partially wrong, the institutional conditions had to stand. Catherine had given him the honest version of what he'd been feeling, which was that the terms were too rigid in areas that didn't matter and appropriately firm in areas that did. And the correction, making the frameworks more precise rather than looser, gave Charles what he actually needed without undermining what William was protecting. And here's the part that nobody in the room said out loud, but everyone felt. Harry, because Harry was the reason for all of it. The reason Charles pushed, the reason William held, the reason the frameworks existed in the first place. And Harry, while this confrontation played out inside the palace, was in Britain. Present, waiting, not knowing that his father and his brother were arguing about him, about how much room the institution would make for him, about whether the lines drawn around his return were too harsh or exactly right. Harry was the absent center of a conflict between two people who loved him differently. Charles loved him as a son and wanted to give him more. William loved him as a brother and wanted the institution to hold. And neither of them was wrong. The tragedy is that loving the same person in different ways can produce a conflict as deep as any disagreement about principle. There's also a public dimension to this that matters, because the British public is watching. And the public, which has its own complicated relationship with Harry, would read this confrontation in ways the family cannot fully control. If it became known that Charles pushed for looser terms and William refused, part of the country would see William as cold, another part would see Charles as weak, and a third part would see the whole thing as proof that the family is still, after everything, unable to manage the Harry question without tearing itself apart. The family's awareness of this public dimension is part of what made the resolution so important. Because the resolution Catherine found, precision rather than flexibility or rigidity, produced an answer that could be defended to every part of the public. The institutional terms hold. The personal contact opens. Nobody was overruled. Nobody won. The framework got better. That's the kind of resolution a monarchy can present to a country without looking either cruel or compromised. Now here's the third twist, and it reveals something about the dynamic between Charles and William that will shape the rest of this reign. Because the confrontation, however it resolved, established something new between them. It established that William would say no to the king, that the frameworks William built were not subject to Charles's override, that when the institution's principles were at stake, the heir would hold the line against the sovereign if necessary. That precedent is enormous, because it means Charles can no longer assume that William will defer, that the quiet agreement that has governed their relationship, where Charles signs and William builds and both of them move in the same direction, now has a limit. William defers to Charles on most things. On the architecture of the next reign, he does not. And Charles, having tested that limit and found it solid, now knows where it is. And here's what that means for the relationship going forward. Charles will continue to be pulled by emotion. He's a father. He will always want to give Harry more. And William will continue to hold the line that the institution requires. He's the next king. He will always protect the architecture he's building. And those two impulses will collide again, not once. Repeatedly, every time Harry visits. Every time Charles sees his son and feels the limits are too harsh, every time the father's love pushes against the heir's principles. The confrontation that just happened isn't an event. It's the beginning of a pattern. And the pattern, however uncomfortable, is actually healthy for the monarchy because it means the institution has two people pulling it in complementary directions. Charles pulling toward humanity, William pulling toward structure, and the institution held between those two forces, finding its balance in the tension rather than in the triumph of either one. Anne saw this immediately. She told Charles that the confrontation had been good for the family, not comfortable. Good, because a monarchy in which the king is never challenged by the heir is a monarchy in which mistakes go uncorrected, and a monarchy in which the heir never yields to the king is a monarchy that has forgotten that structure exists to serve people, not the other way around. The tension between them, she said, was the thing that would keep the institution honest, and the resolution Catherine had found, making the frameworks more precise rather than looser or firmer, was proof that the tension could produce better outcomes than agreement ever would. Now here comes the final twist. Because the precision Catherine introduced into the frameworks, the sharper distinction between institutional conditions and personal contact quietly solved something else nobody had been focusing on. It solved the Camilla question. Because the same distinction, institutional engagement versus personal contact, applied to Camilla's future as much as it applied to Harry's present. Camilla's institutional standing would end when the reign ended. That was settled. But her personal contact with the family, her ability to see Charles, to maintain private relationships, to exist as a person rather than as a position, had been swept into the same managed category by the same overbroad frameworks. Catherine's precision freed that too. Not the institutional dimension, the human one. And that means the same correction that gave Charles more personal access to Harry also quietly protected Camilla's personal connection to the family after the institutional standing ended. Catherine hadn't done it deliberately. She'd done it by applying the right principle. And the right principle, applied consistently, produced the right outcome for everyone. Nobody celebrated. Charles absorbed the resolution with the complicated feelings of a man who had been told no by his own son and then shown by his daughter-in-law that the no had been partly right and the impulse behind his push had been partly right too. William absorbed it with the recognition that his frameworks needed refinement and that his father's emotion, however disruptive, had identified a genuine flaw. And both of them left the room having learned something about the other that they would carry for the rest of their lives. Charles learned that William will hold the line. William learned that his father's love is a force the institution has to account for, not override. And the monarchy learned that the tension between a king who leads with his heart and an heir who leads with his architecture is not a weakness. It's the thing that keeps the institution from becoming either too cold or too soft. So here's where I hand it to you. Was William right to refuse his father, to hold the institutional line even when the king pushed against it? Was Charles right to push, to insist that the terms were too harsh for the actual human being who had returned? Is Catherine's solution, sharper precision rather than looser frameworks, the right answer? And does the fact that the same precision quietly protects Camilla's personal future prove that the right principle, applied consistently, serves everyone? There is no clean answer, and anyone who hands you one quickly hasn't sat with the full weight of it. Charles pushed, William held, Catherine found the way through, and the monarchy discovered that the tension between them is the thing that keeps it alive. And here's the thing this confrontation reveals about the transition itself. Because the transition will require these two men to agree on everything, or at least to manage their disagreements without the institution fracturing. And this confrontation proved they can disagree profoundly on something deeply personal and still arrive at a resolution that serves the institution. That's the most important test a transition can pass. Transitions fail not when two parties agree on everything, but when they disagree and can't resolve it. Charles and William just disagreed deeply and resolved it, not through one winning and the other losing, through Catherine finding a more precise version of the truth that both could accept. That's how a healthy institution processes conflict. And the fact that this family can do it, even on the Harry question, even when the king and the heir are on opposite sides, suggests the transition has a genuine chance of succeeding. Harry, whether he knows it or not, just became the first real test of the next reign's decision-making process. Because the correction Catherine introduced wasn't made by the current king alone, it was made by the partnership of the future reign, William and Catherine, in dialogue with the current one, Charles and Anne. The process that produced the resolution looked, in miniature, like the process that will govern the monarchy after the handover. Disagreement, tension, a precise answer found by the incoming generation and accepted by the outgoing one. Harry's return didn't just test the frameworks, it tested the transition itself. And the transition, under pressure, held when the next chapter moves. You already know where to look for the parts nobody else will tell you. The next chapter of this family is still being written, and when it moves, we will be here to talk about it. If this video made you see any part of this story differently, drop your position in the comments. I read every one of them. And on a question this complicated, I genuinely want to know where you land. Subscribe if you are not already with us, because the next chapter is coming, and it is going to be one worth watching.